Hey guys, welcome back. So today I'm working on this 5,000 watt Powermate generator. This is powered by a 10 horse Tecumseh engine, and I'm told it runs and makes power. The person selling it was only asking 50 bucks, and that was due to the fact that he said the tank was damaged and needed to be replaced. So yeah, I didn't ask too many questions. All I did was pull the engine over, make sure it wasn't stuck, and that it had compression, and it does. So I would say at a minimum, the engine is good, but I have not tried starting it yet. So I do want to get it running, at least for a few seconds, see if the engine sounds good, if the generator makes power, and then take a closer look at this tank, because I have not found any damage on this tank. It is a plastic tank. They don't rust out, but I did notice that it's missing the fuel petcock and the bushing. So if that's all this tank needs, then I think we'll be in pretty good shape. So let me get set up a little bit better and get going on this. Let's check the oil real quick. Yeah, the oil needs to be changed, and it is on the low side. So I'm going to top that off a bit, and then I want to try starting it. I'm not going to put fuel in the carb, just give it a little squirt of starting fluid and see if this thing comes to life. Yeah, that's perfect. Nice. Let's try it again. Got to be honest, I didn't expect much for 50 bucks, but the engine, it runs, it sounds good, and the generator makes power. So let's try adding a little bit of fuel to that carburetor and see if it'll keep running on its own. I attached this line. I was going to use it to add fuel into the carburetor. And when I did that, the weight of the line pulled down the existing line, and a bunch of fuel spilled onto the floor. You can see the stains right there, and it smells terrible. This has not run in quite some time, and I would say there was most likely fuel left in that carburetor. So I'm going to not even try to run it on the carburetor. I'm going to get the carb off, clean it up. This fuel line too is in pretty bad shape, so that needs to be replaced. So I say we deal with the fuel system, including the tank, get it all back together, and see if we can't run this for a little bit longer. But before I do that, I think this one has earned an oil change. The oil looked pretty dark and thick, so I do want to get that changed out, even though the engine's not fully warmed up. It's been about 10 minutes, and it's still draining, but I think we're getting close. So yeah, that oil's pretty thick. Definitely needed to be changed. According to the user manual, this should take 720 milliliters of oil. It's perfect. The tank is damaged right there. And that is right above the exhaust. So I was kind of wondering about that. This exhaust, I don't think it's stock. Someone added this to it, and it's taller than it should be right up against this heat shield. And apparently it was a little too close, caused that damage. And surprisingly, the generator did not burn to the ground. That could have been a bad situation. Anyway, I do have some extra tanks. I don't think any of them will fit this generator, but let me try a few out, see if any will fit. A little bit too long, I'd say by about 2 inches. Otherwise, it's the perfect tank, but that's not going to work. Maybe. It's a little bit too wide, but technically I could probably get it to work, but it does look odd. Not bad. Although still not quite right. The bottom of the tank, it's hitting the control panel, and it's also bottomed out on the heat shield. So this one has potential. Yeah, so something like that might work. The heat shield is preventing it from dropping all the way down, as well as these studs. You know, this one, dimensionally, it's pretty good. So we'll keep that on the short list. I think the biggest issue with this one is that I don't have the rollover valve, and that's not a part I've been able to locate for this particular tank. So yeah, I guess we have a few possibilities. None of them are great. But for now, let's just get the carb cleaned up, and we'll worry about this in a bit. Getting the carb off can be a little tricky because the nut for this side is pretty much inaccessible, but there is a Phillips screw on the back side, so I'm hoping to get it off that way. Otherwise, the whole intake manifold needs to come off. Trying to save that gasket, but it's not looking too good. So what do you think? Nice and clean? I don't think so. This one smells pretty bad. Although I give it hope. The bowl nut is usually a good sign. If it comes out all corroded, then you know you have issues. But that looks pretty good. Not terrible, but not great. I think that is rust. So we'll have to see if this one can be cleaned up. I think I do have other bowls that'll fit this, so that's not a big deal. The carb itself actually looks to be in very good shape. The carb body, the float, the needle. Let's take that out. That is the air fuel mix for the idle circuit. I'm going to turn it in, see where it's set at now. It was one turn out. Yeah, and that's more or less it. The emulsion tube on this is removable, but I have a bad track record of getting them out, especially the plastic ones. This one actually looks to be brass. So, yeah, let's try to get that one out. You know what? I don't want to force it. The top part of this carb looks to be in very good shape. I have no reason to believe the emulsion tube is an issue. I think the real issue here was the bowl and what came out of it. So that, if possible, needs to be cleaned up or replaced. So I'll try to clean that up, go through all the passages, make sure they're clear, and I think we'll be good to go. Need to get the needle out of the main jet as well. This is an adjustable main jet, which is a really nice thing to have. Most do not have that anymore. Yeah, it's just under one turn out. Cleaned up surprisingly well with just a wire brush. So this is the other bowl I have, and you can see it's in great shape, but this bowl, the material is extremely thin, and this one is a much thicker gauge metal. So even though some of it is pitted and rusted away, I'd say this has a longer lifespan than this guy right here. So I'm going to stick with this for now. Carburetor cleaned up pretty well. Not that it was that bad to begin with. I think the bowl was really the only issue, and I probably could have got away with just cleaning the bowl. But now, I think we're guaranteed to have a good running machine. So we'll put this back together, set the jetting back to where it was, and try it out. Yeah, the float height's off. It should be a little bit more level. And although this is a plastic float, I'm pretty sure the tab is metal, which means it's adjustable. So you just have to bend this tab out just a little bit. And that should fix the issue. So the main jet was almost one turn out. I'm going to use this brass fitting to just join the new fuel line to the old and hopefully just pull the new one right through. If this doesn't work, then you really most likely need to remove the blower housing to get the access you need. Before trying to start this again, I need to deal with this issue. The cord is a little bit short. For some reason, there's a knot tied in it. And more importantly, it's frayed and it's going to fall apart pretty soon. So let's get a new cord on there. Let's just see how long this cord is. Usually I put about 5 turns in here. So there's 1, 2, 3, almost 4. I think if that knot wasn't there, there'd be 4 turns. So that's the minimum. So it's not as short as I thought, but I think the big issue here is that knot. So yeah, let's get this one out. We'll see if I can get 5 turns in there. Yeah, so I can't turn the spring anymore. So let's put that right there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, no issues with 5. So let's get that handle on to finish it up. So I think we're just about there. There is one thing I want to test though, and that is the kill switch, because the way it works is that this wire, this little wire right here, has to ground out to kill spark. Well, the wire looks to be painted and the throttle control is painted, so I'm not really sure that that's going to shut the engine down. So I'm going to get the spark tester on there. We'll try it like this, just make sure we get spark, slide it down, and see if spark goes away. I'm going to use this tester. This was actually made by a subscriber. He made this himself. These are actually magnets, so you can just stick one end to the ignition wire and the other end to a source of ground. And if we have spark, this light will light up. So let's turn the ignition on. I'll kill the lights and keep your eye on that. All right, good spark. We'll shut it off. And it lights up a little, but I think that will be enough to kill spark. But to be sure, let's try the other tester where it has to actually jump a gap of 1/4 of an inch, and that'll tell us for sure if it'll kill the spark. So I'm going to try first with the ignition on. We should see the spark jump. And we do, good strong spark. Now with the ignition off. And no spark. So I think we're good. Gonna give it a quick try. It's laid out right now, so I can't do it outside. And I can't really run it long in here. Even though I have ventilation and carbon monoxide detectors, I really can't run it for more than a minute or so. So what I'm gonna do is hopefully get it started. I might tweak the jetting enough if I have time, and I'll double check what the output's at. We're not flooding over, so we're off to a good start. Not too bad. The engine sounds good, but it is stuttering a bit. I think it's carburetor related because when I apply the choke halfway, that kind of smooths out. So I think the jetting's off or there's issues with the carb, so I do want to get it restarted after things air out in here. The other issue is the engine speed was slow. So I tried bumping the throttle up as far as I could, and then I realized there is no governor spring attached to this throttle. The only point of it is to ground the coil out. The actual adjustment is around here on the back. There is a spring right there, and it has a fixed amount of tension right there. So that spring is a bit rusty, and when they rust, they do lose a little bit of their spring. So I'm gonna turn that in a little bit. We'll restart it, maybe set that speed roughly to 60 Hertz. I'll adjust the jetting a bit, try to get it a little closer to where it needs to be. that's about all I can do for now. I got to wait till the morning to get this outside and run it for an extended period of time. It is fighting me a bit, but the engine does smooth out when the choke is half applied. So I think we are dealing with a carburation issue. But the adjustments I made to the jetting, it helped, but it didn't get rid of the engine stuttering. And the engine speed, I couldn't really adjust either. I need a deep well socket of the right size, which I thought I had, but nothing is fitting on there. So I'm actually going to re-add the air box, and we'll try this again in the morning. When cleaning out the ultrasonic cleaner, I found this tiny little washer in the bottom, and I wasn't sure where it came from, but I do clean out that ultrasonic after each carb, so I know it came from here. And when putting it together, there was an O-ring and a washer on the bottom needle for the main jet, but I didn't notice anything here on that pilot needle, so I'm guessing that's where it goes. So I'm going to remove it, take a look, see if the O-ring is still in there. If it is, then I'll just add the washer and put it back in, and potentially that is the run issue. I do see the O-ring in there, so I'm just going to add the washer to the needle and reinstall it. All right, it's the next morning, so let's give this another try. Now, as far as the issue, I'm not sure the audio is really picking it up very well, but what I'm hearing is that every once in a while the engine doesn't fire correctly. The whole engine shakes, and when it happens, the throttle starts moving around until things stabilize again. Now, this carburetor, I think it's a clone. I have not found any markings on it. And the choke, I think, is a dead giveaway because choke on is back and off is toward the engine, which that orientation does not seem right to me. So I would say either we have a bad clone carb or just a bad carb based on the rust that was in there, or the wrong carb altogether. So I'm not sure if we're going to make any progress here, but let's give it a shot. The good news is, under 1500 watts, the engine stabilized and ran perfectly. Without a load, the engine struggles. So yeah, that carb, I think, needs to be replaced. Now, I do have another carb for an HM100. It is not the correct part number for this HM100, but it is brand new. It's a clone. I guess the only downside is the jetting is fixed. So I think I'm going to swap that one onto here and see if it runs the engine any better. This is definitely the wrong carb. I would say this is more for a 7-horse engine. And I can tell that by the diameter of the throat. I just measured it. It comes in at about 20 millimeters. And when I measure the throat of this other one, which is for an HM100, it comes out closer to 23 millimeters, and that matches the size of the intake. So hopefully this one will run a little better. I would say that carb ran the engine a little bit worse, but similar symptoms. Under load, the engine smooths right out. So I think based on that, I can cross fuel off the list. I can also cross spark off the list as well, because under a load, I don't think spark would improve. So that doesn't leave much other than valves. So let's get it inside and take a look at those valves. I've already gone ahead and removed the carburetor. Now I do need to remove the intake manifold to access the valve cover so I can check the valve clearance and release the valves from the head. Also, I need to get off the blower housing and all the tins covering up that engine head. These bolts worry me a bit. They're a little bit undersized and crusty. Cylinder looks to be in pretty good shape considering the age of this engine. I've seen newer engines that look quite a bit worse. The piston is nice and tight in the bore. It's not rocking around. So let's rotate this to top dead center and double check the valves. At top dead center, they should both be closed, which it looks like they are, and you should not be able to spin them if they're seating. And both of these are in there tight and not spinning. So on the surface, everything looks to be pretty good with this engine. So if I had to bet, I would say the exhaust valve is the issue here, because when the engine was kind of misfiring, there was nothing coming out of the carburetor. It seemed to be more in the exhaust. And I think the icing on the cake was that I was on a live stream the other day with a bunch of small engine guys. We were talking about upcoming projects. And as soon as I mentioned I was working on a 10-horse Tecumseh flathead, Ken from Ken Small Engine said, exhaust valves, they always stick on these machines. So I hope he's right, because I am not seeing anything else wrong with this engine. So let's get the valves out with the valve stems cleaned up. We'll lap the valves in, clean everything up, and put it back together. So let's take a look at the valves. This wire here, I think it's just a ground. We'll get that off. So we got to remove these two bolts, and we also have to remove this nut for the governor spring. So we'll have to reset that later. And of course, I don't have a deep well socket, so what I did earlier was just use a 3/8 shallow and a screwdriver. See where the clearance is at. We'll start with the exhaust. It should be 12 thousandths. And it's tighter than 12. Let's try an 8. 8 does not fit. We'll try the 8 on the intake. The intake is supposed to be at 8 thousandths. And the 8 fits on the intake. Let's try a 6. Does not fit. How about a 4? Nope. We'll try a 3. Does not fit. And the smallest one I have is a 1.5 thousandths. And it does not fit. So that exhaust valve is way out of spec. It's supposed to be at 12 thousandths. 1.5 does not fit. So it's pretty close to 0. It's not 0 though, or at least it's not to the point where the valve is hanging open when the engine's cold. But what I'm thinking now is that maybe the valve isn't sticking. It's just when the engine warms up, the metal heats up, the valve stem length grows by just a little bit, maybe 1/1000th, and then we start to lose clearance. And when the generator's under load, when the engine's under load, there's higher compression, forcing that valve to seat. And when under no load, there's just not enough compression to force it to seat. And that's why we're getting what we're getting. So this engine's actually very close to not running at all based on that. So let's check the intake. I know 8 thousandths fit. So there's actually plenty of clearance on the intake, maybe more than there should be. So we'll try a 10. 10 fits on the intake. 12 fits, has a little bit of drag. So the intake, it's a little bit excessive, but that's not the run issue. It's definitely the exhaust. So let's get the valves out. They don't have any keepers. It's just the valve spring retainer has a slot. So I might be able to just get it out without using a compressor tool. Surprisingly, the exhaust valve does not look burned. So yeah, it should clean up pretty well. And the intake, the valve that was working well, is pretty dirty. So we'll get both these valves cleaned up. I want to get the surface cleaned up. We'll fix the clearance issue and start putting this back together. Not sticking. The exhaust valve came out pretty good. For some reason, though, I can't get a suction cup to stick on the intake. I think the shape is just not really allowing that to happen, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to lap the intake. I'm going to try one more trick, which involves double-sided sticky tape, and hope for the best. That worked far better than I imagined. Might use that going forward because even in the best case, the suction cup usually pops off a dozen times or so, but the double-sided tape kept it right on. The valve looks good. Seats look good too. Let me show you. Got pretty lucky on the exhaust valve. It easily could have been burnt with the close to zero clearance. Things look pretty good though. I just double checked the clearance of the intake valve after lapping it in, and the clearance went from 12 thousandths down to 10, so we're a lot closer to where we should be. Either way, it would not have been an issue. The exhaust, however, I'm sure we lost what little clearance we had left, so let's get 12 thousandths of clearance on that exhaust valve. I'll be the first one to admit this is not the right way to use this tool. So I do have my safety glasses on. I do not recommend this. The proper way is to do it this way, but because of the curve on the disc, you're not going to get a flat surface, and I need a flat surface, and this is the only tool that I have that'll do that. So the idea is once it's up to speed, take a little bit off while spinning the valve. That'll help ensure you get a nice flat surface, and try to keep it as perpendicular as possible, and only do it maybe 10 seconds, 20 at most, and check the clearance. You're going to have to do that a bunch of times because if you take too much off, there's no way to put it back. You just have to buy a new valve. I just double checked. We're not even at 4,000s yet. So we are just a bit past 4,000s, I think. Let me just double check with the 8. And we're not at 8 yet. We've passed 8,000s. Let's check 10. A little bit of drag on 10. So we're just about there. Let's try 12. It's not 12, but we're close. And 11 fits with a lot of drag. So we're pretty much there. I want to be really careful and just take a tiny bit more off. If I take too much off, it's going to affect the compression release, because the way the compression release works on this is that when the engine's spinning slow, the exhaust valve gets bumped and some of the compression comes out. If that clearance is too big, when the tappet goes to bump the exhaust, if the gap is too big, it won't actually bump the valve, and you'll be at full compression trying to start this thing. So just a tiny bit more. Try 11 again. Tiniest bit of drag. Let's try 12 thousandths. A lot of drag, but it can move. And we'll try 13 thousandths. And doesn't move at all. So we're right there. That's perfect. It's going to be pretty much the same process for the top of the head. We just need to get it nice and clean. especially the sealing surfaces. As far as the carbon goes, I mean, it's good to get it off because these chunks, they can break off and scratch the cylinder. Ran down to the local small engine shop today and picked up a head gasket and 2 valve cover gaskets. It was only $14, and this should allow me to get the core of this engine back together. So that's what I'm going to do now. Now I am still waiting for a few parts though. I did order a new old stock exhaust from eBay. It is a lower profile exhaust. It was about $20. That'll be here in a few days. And I also ordered a new carburetor. Although this one seems to be more the correct part, I want one with adjustable jetting, and this does not have that. So $27 from Amazon will get me adjustable jetting. So we're waiting for those other parts. Once this is back together, we'll fix this tire issue and figure out what we're going to do about this tank. If I'm lucky, this will just come off without leaving stuff behind, but I can see I'm not lucky. And it's rare that they do come off without leaving material behind. So I do usually use a razor blade to get the bulk of it off. You just have to be really careful. I would say use a new razor blade and don't dig in to the aluminum. So if I remember right, the first gasket goes there. This is the orientation. Goes in like that. Then we add this little guy right here. And then on the back of the valve cover is the second gasket. It'll be good enough to start. Once it's running, we are going to have to adjust that engine speed. I picked up a new tank today. It's not quite the same as the original. So before installing the new tank, I wanted to fully understand what happened with the old tank. So the tank is back on, as well as the heat shield. And if I tip the tank up so we can look at the damage, you'll see it starts right about there. And if you look down here, that heat shield ends right where the damage begins. So that is the cause of the issue with the oversized exhaust. You know, if I hold it roughly in place and look at the heat shield, you can see it extends past that heat shield by at least an inch. And yeah, that's no good. So the new exhaust I got it's much smaller. It just exits straight up and to the left, and it will be fully under this heat shield. So I don't think we're going to have a repeat of this issue. The really interesting thing is that this is actually a Tecumseh exhaust that shows up on the parts diagram for this engine. So the person who ordered this, I'm sure, thought he wasn't doing anything wrong. But based on what I'm seeing, I would say this exhaust system, although it's meant for this engine, was not meant for this application. Now, that's not the only thing causing this issue, the heat shield and the exhaust. I think it was compounded by two other things. The tank was actually empty, I believe, when this happened. The person I got this from had a boat tank on top and was running the generator that way. So with an empty tank, there would have been no fuel to kind of dissipate the hot spot, and that's just made the situation worse. And the icing on the cake is what we found with that exhaust valve. Since it was not closing properly, instead of just hot exhaust gas coming out of the exhaust system, it was actually combustion, fuel on fire getting sent into that exhaust. So instead of its normal temperature, which is quite hot, it would have been quite a bit hotter and most likely glowing red. And that, combined with all these other issues, caused this tank to fail. On first look, this tank looks to be a pretty good match. I did have to modify it a bit. These holes here were not quite lining up with the studs. They were off just a little bit, so I had to increase the diameter of these holes all the way around so that it would drop on the existing studs. But now that it is, I can see there are a few other issues going on here. First, it's not dropping all the way in back here, and that's because this control panel is in the way just a little bit. You can see right there is some interference. So in order for this to work, this tank would have to slide, I would say, half an inch toward the front. And the other issue is the heat shield. It's right up against the bottom of the tank. This tank is slightly deeper than the one that was on there. And even with the original tank, the clearance was pretty tight, maybe half an inch, which I'm not too comfortable with. So I do need to drop that heat shield down, I would say, an inch. And lastly, although the exhaust is going to end right about here, it'll be under the heat shield, but only just. You know, I'd feel better if that heat shield was down another inch or two. So to correct those issues, what I'm going to have to do is cut these studs out, slide everything down about an inch, at least the tank down an inch, so this will drop in, slide the heat shield down 2 or 3 inches, and we'll drill some new holes through the frame and secure everything. Cut all the studs off and use the grinder to smooth it out. So let's give it a test fit here. Actually, this piece is going to have to go underneath to get that extra inch of clearance. I think that's pretty good. We have sufficient clearance from the control panel, so everything dropped down in place. My original plan, though, was to slide the heat shield down a little bit further than the tank to offer some more protection, but I can't really do that because the heat shield, the length of it is only from really this bolt hole to the next. So if I slide that shield down a couple extra inches, then I'm not going to be able to secure this the way that I want to. You know, that said, I think we're pretty good. I mean, everything is better than it was before. We have the hot air exiting the head right here. It's being directed out. Any hot air up here should most likely come out with that. The new exhaust, the furthest over it goes is right there. And if we follow that up, we have a good, I would say 2 or 3 inches before that heat shield ends. So overall, I think it's going to work out pretty well. The one thing I don't like though is this access hole right here. That was for the spark plug. And now that everything is shifted, that is not going to do anything. In order to service the plug, you do need to remove the tank. But I don't think that's going to matter anyway because this tank does not have the cutout in it like the old one did for servicing the spark plug. So yeah, it's not ideal, but it's a big improvement over what was there. And if you look at the spacing between the tank and the heat shield, that is also pretty good. So I think we're just about there. I just want to patch that hole to offer a little more protection. We'll drill some holes here, get everything secured. I think the tank will be in good shape. I'm just going to use this extra plate I have hanging around. It's meant for electrical work. In this case, though, it should work fine. So drill a few holes and rivet it in place. That's a pretty big milestone. Everything went together the way I had hoped. We have some nice clearance on the heat shield. The hole is plugged up and everything lines up just fine. Anyway, this is not the permanent install. The tank needs to come back off so I can clean up the frame. And on the final install, I'm going to use these nylock nuts to hold everything firmly in place without over tightening the tank to the frame. Also, I'm going to add these rubber washers between the metal washer and the tank just to offer a little more protection. Anyway, let's move on to the wheels, see if we can't get this issue sorted out. See a couple issues with this wheel. I think the biggest is that it doesn't really spin very well. It's really tight and there's no spacer, so it's rubbing against the frame, and I think these push nuts that hold it on are just pinching everything too tight. So I'm going to get this off. We'll try adding a spacer and use an actual bolt, and I think this will spin a lot better. Much better. Let's do the other side. This one has a different issue. It looks like the hub might be bent. Either that or the axle is. Nope, not the axle. It is the wheel. So I do have other wheels. I don't think they look quite as good as this, but at least they're not bent. I have a set of these wheels. I think they're from a lawnmower. It's kind of a downgrade from what's on there now as far as the looks go. More importantly, there's no issues with the hub, and they are the right diameter. So I'm going to put this one on, and we'll swap out the one on the other side so we have a matching set. Let's try it out. Oh yeah, that is much better. We're just about there. We only have the exhaust and the carb. And to that end, I did receive the carb today. So I'm going to get that installed. I'm not going to show you that because you've already seen how to do it. And when the exhaust gets here, I'll turn you back on. We'll get that final piece installed and try it out. I ended up putting that fixed jet carb back on. The clone that I got, despite having the right part number, definitely not the right part. The choke moves in the wrong direction. When I connected it to the governor rod, there was a ton of slop. That would have caused surging for sure. The icing on the cake is the orientation of this throttle up here. Right now, it's at idle, and you see the hole where the governor rod goes is right up in the front. If I move this one to idle, it's way over there. Completely different orientation. So this one has no chance of working. This is the most correct one I have. So although it didn't run the engine great with the exhaust valve issue, I'm hoping it's going to do a better job now. The exhaust showed up today, so I'm going to get that installed. There is the old gasket on here, which actually seems to be in pretty good shape. So I'm going to try to reuse that. I did remove the tank. We'll keep that off until everything's painted up. And I did have to remove these bolts to gain access to this one here, which helps hold that exhaust system in. All right, let's give this a quick try. I want to get it started, see if it'll run for more than 20 seconds without misfiring. And while it's warming up, I'm going to adjust the engine speed roughly to where it needs to be. Well, I wouldn't say that was great. I mean, the engine, I think, sounded better, but it was also blowing flame out of the exhaust. So it's not running right. I think the jetting is off. It would not start with the choke on. And even with the choke off, it seemed like it was running rich. So I'm going to go back to the original carb and try this again. This engine's putting up a fight. It's actually a few days later, had to walk away and just give this one some thought. Anyway, things have escalated. I'll talk about that in a second. As far as the smaller carb goes, the undersized one, it does run the engine better. It doesn't matter, though, which carb I put on it. The engine, though, is still misfiring. Something isn't quite right. And carburation was my initial thought. And when I dug into it, I found the wrong carb. Thought replacing it with the proper sized one would have fixed the issue. And it didn't. So I tried every combination of adjusting the jetting, applying partial choke. I even sprayed some carb cleaner along the gasket areas looking for an intake leak and haven't found it. So carburation, it's not the problem. The next logical step was valves. So you saw what happened there. I did find an issue, but like the carburetor, it was not the issue that I was chasing. So what does that leave? We've got compression, spark, and timing. And the compression actually feels very good. We did a load test, 3,000 watts. That needs 6 horsepower, and this engine ran that without any issue. And I also did a compression test. It came in at 70 psi, and that is actually higher than I expected. This has a compression release. Usually that's around 60, so it seems to be pretty good. And when pulling the engine over, when I hit the actual compression, the compression holds. The leak down is minimal. So compression, don't think that's the issue. Timing, not the issue either. When I first had this blower housing off, I double checked the timing by looking at the magnet. I just put the engine at top dead center. When it's at top dead center, the magnet should just be clearing the ignition coil, and it was. But as a double check, I just pulled the flywheel to check that key, and I found nothing wrong. The key looked perfect. So timing, it's not it. So that just leaves spark. And to that end, I swapped the plug out with a new Champion RJ19LM, and the engine ran worse. So I put the old plug back in. I then put a spark tester in line so I could see the spark. I wanted to see if the intensity of the spark tester light was consistent and if that light was going out at all when it misfired. And I didn't see that. The consistency was good. We weren't missing any spark. So, yeah, not the issue. So what's left? The gap. I checked the gap. It was 0.010 of an inch. It's where it should be. So that is not the issue. So maybe there's a problem with the coil. I broke out the multimeter, checked the resistance of the primary and the secondary, and I think I may have found a problem. Let me show you. To test one of these coils, it's not that difficult. You just need a multimeter that can measure ohms, and then you need to know what the expected values are. And in this case, I've never tested a Tecumseh coil, so I did have to do a little bit of research, and it seems like the primary should be between 200 and 400 ohms, and the secondary, I would say, between 2,500 ohms and 5,000 ohms. So let's see where this one's at by checking the primary first. You want to find a clean spot of metal without too much rust, and the other lead goes to the kill tab, and that should give you the reading of the primary coil, and we're at 260 ohms, so that is perfect. And then we'll check the secondary. This is the wire that runs up to the spark plug. So we'll put one lead right there, and again the other lead goes to the body of the ignition coil. You can see right now we're not getting anything. Let me just move this around a little. Try it again. Nothing. And that's way too high. Right now we're at about 600,000 ohms. 5,000 is the most you really want on a healthy coil. So I don't know if the issue is right here. Maybe it's corroded. or maybe there's something wrong in there. So I think I'm going to just cut off the end. We'll stick the probe in directly on the wire and do the same test again. Now we'll test direct right to the wire. And we're at 5.4 thousand ohms. So that seems reasonable. So whatever the issue was, I think it was a bad crimp or maybe some corrosion. So let me see if I have another one of these, and we'll try it one more time. I did come up with one connector. I don't crimp a lot of these wires, so hopefully I don't mess it up. So the idea is you want to strip back some of this insulation and just get the bare wire exposed. And they do sell specialized tools for this, but I'm just going to make do with what I have. I just twist the wires a bit, bend them back. Actually, I'm going to bend it the other way. And then just crimp it down. And let's check the resistance now through here. 5.4 thousand ohms. That is a lot better. So let me get this back together. We'll try it one more time. Yeah, not quite the result I was hoping for. 3 problems found, 3 problems fixed, any of which could have been causing the misfire, yet the misfire, it still exists. You know, I don't think it's coming through very well on the audio. In person, it sounds quite a bit worse. So I would like to fix it if possible. And I would not rule out the ignition coil. Even though we fixed the issue with the resistance on the secondary, it doesn't mean that the coil couldn't be bad. It does seem to behave like that, meaning as the engine warms up, the misfires get worse and more frequent. So it might be worth throwing a coil at it just to see if that makes a difference. You know, regardless, I think I need to move on. This video is a little bit long. We still need to paint it, put it together, and do an extended test. So let's move on. Okay, hopefully this comes apart without any issues. Makes me a little nervous though. This is old plastic, about 33 years old. I think it came out pretty well. So we'll give that some time to dry up. And when it does, I'll flip it over, paint the underside, and we should be good to go. It's been a couple days. The paint is cured. Came out really nice. So let's get it back together. going to make one more attempt to get this engine to run right. Initially, I was thinking it was an issue with the valves because the engine runs good under a medium to heavy load. And in those conditions, there's higher compression in the cylinder. And if a valve isn't quite seating right, that could get it to seat correctly until you take the load off. Well, after fixing the valve, it didn't fix the issue. So I'm thinking now I need to double check the intake. Although I sprayed it with carb spray while it was running, I didn't detect a leak. But to be honest, I didn't spray a lot up here because of the proximity of the exhaust system. And this gasket, although it looked good, it was a very thin gasket. So yeah, maybe there is an intake leak. So I'm going to get this off. We'll put new gaskets on. I'm going to sand this flat as well, just to make sure we get a good seal. It's interesting that it's painted right here. You know, this engine wasn't supposed to be painted. I think someone painted it up after they bought it, and they didn't do a great job. Unfortunately, a lot of that paint is flaking right off. Yeah, no issues there. It was already flat. This is the side that goes to the engine. Let's check the other side. Yeah, I don't really see any issues there either. It's sanding nice and evenly. I'll do it a little bit more. But I'm kind of very doubtful that this is the issue because choking the engine or opening up the jets should have compensated if it was an intake leak. But at this point, it's worth a try. All right, let's give this a try. So I've been holding it out here. I did end up buying the OEM carb. I found it on eBay for about half the price of a new carb from a parts site. Now this is essentially a new carb. I have already tried it and it actually ran the engine pretty bad, but it's the correct part and the small carb doesn't actually work properly, meaning it can't open the throttle all the way. Just the orientation of where the linkage connects isn't correct for this engine, so it doesn't get any more than half throttle. And although it runs it okay-ish, you know, the right part should be on here. All right, let's give this a quick try. I've got it all fueled up, ready to go. The pilot jet is set to 1.5 turns out and the main jet 1.25. So we'll start it, see how it sounds, make some adjustments, and hopefully the misfire is gone. Thought we had it for a second. Unfortunately, it is still misfiring. So I'm going to double check the compression while the engine's still hot. So last time I checked this, it was off camera. We had 70 PSI, which is higher than I expected. Usually with compression release, I see closer to 60. So let's see if we're still at 70. Yeah, we're at 70 PSI still, so that has not changed. So let's check the leak down, see what that's at. All right, we're at top dead center of the compression stroke. So we'll give this a try. If it's not perfectly at top dead center, the engine is going to rotate. So it does take a few attempts to get this. And I'm going to start at 0 on the gauge on the left and pressurize the cylinder to 100 PSI. And what I want to see is that the leak down ideally is in the green, but I've had engines up to 60% leak down that run just fine. So let's see where this one's at. I'll bring the pressure up. So we're up to 100 PSI on the gauge on the left, and we're at 10% leak down, which is excellent. You know, most small engines I test are above 20%. So I don't think we have an issue with the rings. Actually, let me pressurize it again and just see if we have any leak down out of the valves. Nothing on the intake, and nothing on the exhaust. So all this leak down is past the rings, and 10% leak down is excellent. I'm going to try this leak down test again because I did do this earlier off camera. And most of the time I had 10% leak down. There were a couple times I saw something very unusual at low pressures. Hopefully I can replicate it here. Bring the pressure up. Yeah, you can see we're at 10 PSI. This gauge is not tracking very closely, and that is the issue I saw before. With low pressure in, we were getting a high leak down. It's not coming from the exhaust, not coming from the intake. Let's bring the pressure up a little more. And then something just happened. That jumped up quite a bit, and now we have a good seal. So it's only doing it at low pressure. But it almost seems like the rings, maybe they're not seating properly. Maybe they're worn out. But the fact that it's always so good at high pressure is kind of odd. You know, I don't know if that is a clear sign that I should replace the rings. The cylinder looked good. Granted, the crosshatch was gone, so the engine does have a fair amount of hours on it. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, guys, I'm not really sure where to go on this one. I mean, I've crossed everything off the list at this point. You know, for an engine to run properly, you need fuel, spark, timing, and compression. And we have timing. I pulled the flywheel off. Timing is not an issue. As far as spark goes, putting a new plug in made no difference. Fixing this issue here made no difference. I even unplugged the kill wire and replaced the ignition coil. That footage I cut out, trying to keep this video under 2 hours, which I also failed at. And yeah, the new coil made no difference. The magnet on the flywheel seems to be strong, and I re-gapped the coil several times. So it's not timing, it's not spark, and it's not fuel. I've tried 3 different carbs. You just saw new gaskets installed, sanded this nice and flat, and we still have the issue. So the only thing left that it could be is compression. And to that end, we have 70 PSI, which is good for something with compression release. And the leak down is 10%. So there's really no clear direction on what's wrong with this engine. You know, I think at this point, a complete teardown of the engine might reveal something. You know, I'm thinking possibly rings, or maybe there's something with that exhaust valve sticking. I'm not sure. So I think the best course of action is just to wrap the video here. Give me some time to think about it, and it'll give you some time to write some comments, because I know some of you guys out there have a lot more experience with this particular engine than I do, and maybe you've come across this issue before, and either you solved it, in which case you can tell me, or you didn't solve it, in which case I'd be interested to know as well, to see how common this issue is with this engine. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.